announcements. I was just about to introduce Lorraine to you, and I just thought I'd better check that she was all right with that, and she is. So, Lorraine, it's good to have you with us today. This is Lorraine's first day with us today, and she's from the craft group. So the craft group started to re-meet during last Friday, and Lorraine tells me that she's been going along for a little while, and she's come to join us today in our service. Please feel welcome, and I hope you go and welcome Lorraine afterwards. Thank you. So we're talking about, last week we introduced this new series that we'll be talking about for a number of weeks now, about being disciples and making disciples, and about doing that every day of our lives. And we went to the well-known passage that most of us know really well at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, before Jesus went back to be with his Father. And we'll have a look at that next slide, please, David. It would be the third slide. So, you've heard a lot of my voice already. Can somebody read that, please?
Therefore, go and make disciples of all the nations, people, ethnic groups, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. And be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age.
Thank you, Alan. So, the whole way that we're trying to look at what Jesus said here, which has been well known for many years in the church, and has been kind of taken very seriously in the church for many years, but I think along with it sometimes comes from misconceptions, or perhaps we put the emphasis in one place and perhaps not the other, and we miss something from it. And so I'm going to use the slogan, less is more. And you've heard that in other contexts. Less is more. And what we're trying to say is that the way that Jesus called people to be his followers, his disciples, we might have, to a point, complicated it. And let's face it, human beings do that. We take things and we work on them and we do them, and then, they kind of evolve, and sometimes we make things very complicated. And I wonder if we have complicated what Jesus told us here today. So, less is more. This is not about saying that we need to do more, because we're all thinking, I'm already so busy, and now I have to go and make disciples. I'm supposed that's part of my faith, to go and make disciples. How am I going to do that? How am I going to fit that into my busy life? And that's where I think we have probably kind of let the emphasis fall away from some things. Because the point is that we don't all stop what we're doing, and instead we set goals to convert people. That's not the point of it, and I'll come back to that. That was a kind of an idea that developed on how we reach the world, which we still agree. We say in our vision, we want to be an accepting community, we want to reflect Jesus, and we want to share the good news with love. So we're not saying that that's not important. Of course it's important. Jesus said it. We're actually saying this because Jesus said, if you're going to leave somewhere, if you leave this life or you leave the earth, what you're going to say is going to be really important, isn't it? You're not going to sort of say trivial things. Well, Jesus, this was one of the last things he said. It was important. And what he said was, go and make disciples. Go and make disciples. You disciples, you're already disciples. Go and make disciples. So it is important. But I reckon that what has happened a lot is that a lot of us have, generally speaking, and I am generalizing, have thought that this is for special people to do. This is for missionaries. This is for people who go to places, all over the world, or some special culture group, and do what Jesus said. And they do it sort of more completely, and we do it maybe just in a little kind of way, or, oh, hang on, that's for them. They've been called to do that. We've got other things to do. And it's got like that. It's as if we have seen this as a specialized thing for some people and not all of us. But Jesus said this to his disciples. Those disciples became the church. That was for everyone. That was not for a select group of people. Now, having said that, I just want to remind you that I'm not saying that it's wrong or not important to heed that call to discipleship and sometimes take steps that people take and go to other cultures, other countries, and so on, and do the work of discipleship. It's not wrong to do that at all. So I'm not underplaying that one bit, but I'm saying that we have to be careful not to underplay our own part in what Jesus is telling us here. If Jesus said it, it must be possible. But we have to just live more intentionally. And I was just thinking about the word intentionally. If it's football season, it's just about to start here in Victoria. So I'll use a football illustration. If in the football tribunal, someone's up for a charge because they bumped a player in a match, one of the things, I don't know all the technical things that happened there, but one of the things they would say was their intention? Did he mean to, did he go out to actually knock that player out, right? Knock the player out of the game. And if they can prove intent, it's a more serious charge because it was deliberate. And we need to be intentional about being a disciple and making disciples. We need to be more aware of it. We need to be more deliberate about it. But that doesn't mean we have to go and do a whole lot of new things that we weren't doing before. We just have to be more conscious of what Jesus says and bring that into our lives. And I'm not going to, this is why we're going to do this over a number of weeks, because we're going to introduce little things in these next weeks that show how we can draw these things into our daily lives. So what I'm going to say today is not all we're going to say about this topic. Disciples are always learning. The word disciple comes out of, in Jesus' day and in the Jewish system, there were rabbis. Rabbis were just teachers. And the rabbis would especially if they were good rabbis, they would get these groups of people around them, and those were their disciples. They were the pupils. So the word disciple is basically the pupil of a teacher. The rabbi was the teacher, the disciple was the pupil. We are referred to as disciples, and we are asked to make disciples. I just want to read this. I want to read this little excerpt from this book that I have. Remember, I need my glasses. From this book that I have been talking about, of this actress, an Australian actress, who, from a very totally, unchurched kind of background, found God, and slowly, on her journey, started to find out what it was to be a disciple and started to live as a disciple. And I'm going to read you this little story now. I'm going to read you something right at the end. Just to illustrate how a disciple learns, how this has so much to do with our everyday life and the things we're doing. It's not like we've got to go somewhere else and do something special. For some of us, that might be appropriate at a certain time. God might call us that way, and God does call people that way. I'm not saying we shouldn't follow that. But here's how this very young follower of Jesus starts to respond to God. And I just want to show you how everyday and how ordinary this is. I was earning well in television, and basically she says she was starting, she's getting some money from her earnings in acting, and then one day God said to her, so she was in a tram, and she heard God's voice, and we would say this is the Holy Spirit prompting us. So this is what she heard it was like the first time she heard this. I caught the tram back to St Kilda, and for the first time in my life I heard the voice of the Holy Spirit. It came as a surprise. I hadn't been praying or thinking about God. The tram was rounding near my stop, and I was looking out the window to the street. A woman was sitting on the pavement drawing. She was homeless, selling her creations. It wasn't an auditory experience, but she's basically saying, but it was very real hearing God speak to me. Get out $50 and give it to that woman. My entire body went rigid. I knew the voice, though I'd never heard it before. It was soft and familiar. If my mind was I'll skip that. I stepped off and walked straight up to an ATM as if under a trance. And then she's speaking to herself. What are you doing? Responding to voices in your head now? I knelt beside the woman and bought a drawing from her for the amount specified by the voice. She was surprised. Now, skipping ahead. She was in another tram a few days later. I was heading to the cinema on another older tram. The light was leaving. People in suits piled up against one another. I had almost forgotten the day's mission. So she was starting to get the feeling like she's just kind of introduced to God. And God was communicating to her at this time, about being compassionate to people. And the way it was happening was to share her material goods with people. So this is how it came to her. So she says, the voice came again. So she was on a mission because she felt like God was saying, listen and watch who I direct you to. About 10 minutes in, a young woman, so she's in a tram, a woman stood up in the middle of the tram, distraught. Has anyone picked up a wallet? It has a $50 food voucher in it. I really need it. She was almost crazed in a desperation, about to break down. No one spoke or moved on the packed tram. The voice hummed, there you go. In other words, God saying, that's the person. I played with the $50 in my pocket. It took me a number of stops to gather the courage to edge down to the back of the tram towards her. I was freaking out. She was thin and grubby. Her hair was pulled back tight and she wore an oversized jersey. There was such pathos about her posture. Have you found the wallet? She trembled. No. I handed her the money from my pocket, not sure what to say. It felt illegal. She looked at me strangely, then hugged me out of nowhere, heavy in relief. And then the lady basically told her other things. She was basically a homeless lady and a bit of a beggar. And Anna, who's writing the book, says that she realized later that this was like a professional beggar, a homeless person who went around and did this, right? But what she learned from it, apart from the fact that when God speaks to you, you need to listen to his voice, but what she learned was that she said, God was calling me all his life, and he was willing to give me everything, but I was reminded that I was like a beggar trying to get tidbits of change from God, trying to get bits and pieces of how to live my life better, when all the time God was ready to give me everything. So that was a kind of a story for her. But I'll come back to another story about money. And I don't tell that story because I'm saying that part of being a follower of Jesus every day is that God will also, we need to hear that voice that God's going to ask us to give money to someone. He might, for some of us, but he might be saying something else. He might be prompting us about something we should do in our family. He might be prompting us about someone we should forgive. He might be prompting us about so many things. He might be prompting us about leaving our work and going somewhere else or doing another work. All sorts of things is part of hearing God's voice. And it doesn't always work out with this brilliant smoothness. And it won't, I don't hear God's voice, and I certainly didn't hear it when I was a young Christian as clearly as she did in that way. But I do hear God's voice, and we can all hear God's voice in many different ways. That is part of being a disciple every day. The second point, so the first point is, we are meant to be disciples every day, and it's for all of us, not just for some people. The second point is that the first believers, the first disciples, did all sorts of work. They were not all full-time workers. Like when we think of missionaries, we think of them as full-time workers doing ministry for God. And we know that there was a group of disciples that went basically with Jesus on his mission. But there was a whole lot of other Christians, a whole lot of other disciples that became disciples as a result of what Jesus and the first disciples did. And they were just doing their ordinary work in life. I read this somewhere just a few days ago. Of 52 parables that Jesus told, 45 had a workplace context. Even the word work in its different forms is mentioned more than 800 times in the Bible, more than all the words used to express worship and praise combined. 54% of Jesus' reported teaching ministry arose from issues posed by others about the scope of daily experience. And just have a quick look at this. This is just a list of some of the next slide, please, Dave. This is what the everyday jobs of the early believers were. And I've just listed some. There's probably lots. If you go through the Bible, you see lots of work jobs. Lawyers, tent makers, doctor, leather workers, Lydia, the businesswoman selling dyed cloth to rich people, shepherds, farmers, tax collectors, people who work for the ATO if they were working today. I think there's a few more rules in the ATO than there was for them at that time. Prison warden, he was converted in Acts chapter 16. Cornelius, the Roman captain, Acts 10. The Ethiopian high government official who Philip brought to Jesus, Acts 9. And Jesus, the carpenter. All the jobs that Christians do. So from their ordinary life, they were also disciples, followers of Jesus, demonstrating Jesus. So the point is that you can be a follower of Jesus and continue doing the work that you do. And I'm talking about work, and I'm conscious that in this church, there are a number of retired people. And I just want to say, so it's not whether you're doing work, as in paid work, or retired, or you're a mum, you might be a mum raising your kids at home. Whatever it is, the fact is, in the things that you're called to do from day to day, we are called to be disciples and make disciples. It is within our everyday life that we do that. And retired people, without the retired people of this church, our church wouldn't be the church it is. There is so much work, so much prayer that the retired people in this church have been doing to keep this church going. So it doesn't matter whether you're working, whether you're retired, be doing something else, but you can still be a disciple, a follower of Jesus. Third point, being a disciple is moving from unbelief to belief. We are all moving from unbelief to belief. The experience of most of us is we're trying to live more faithfully, we're trying to trust God more in our lives, but we still make mistakes and we fall into unbelief. Abraham was a great man of God, and he's looked on by three major religions as a sort of father. He's looked on by the Christians, by the Jews, and by the Muslims, in a sense, as their father. A great man, a man who followed God and obeyed God and became a blessing to many, many people. But Abraham made mistakes. Early when we encounter Abraham, he goes to this new place God calls him to, and things are going well. Then he goes to Egypt because of a famine, and when he's in Egypt, because he's in Egypt, a foreign country, he lies about Sarah, his wife. He says to the king, "Oh no, she's just my sister." And so what happens is basically the king takes, because she's apparently a very beautiful woman, the king takes her into his court, but then things go wrong for the king, and so the king finds out that she's actually Abraham's wife, and then Sarah goes back to Abraham and they leave Egypt. But the point was, Abraham acted in a sense on his own. He didn't trust God there at that point, and things could have gone really pear-shaped for him, but God rescued him. All I'm saying is, great people who are following God still are learning to be faithful. Sometimes they walk in belief, and sometimes they walk in unbelief, and disciples are like that. If we can look at the next slide, please. Okay. Jesus said this in John chapter 8. He said to the people who believe in him, "You are truly my disciples if you remain faithful to my teachings, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." There is a sense there of growing into the truth of all that Jesus brings us in the life that we lead as followers. It's a growing sense, it's a process. And we continue to grow in that process of following and of learning as a pupil to a teacher. You will know. It doesn't all happen at once. It's a growing thing for all of us. And so that leads me to the next slide. Discipleship is the process of moving from unbelief to belief in the gospel in every area of life. In other words, it's the gospel that transforms us. This is the good news that Jesus brought, the gospel that Jesus brought. This gospel of the new way of living, the gospel of the kingdom, and it's belief in the gospel. But sometimes we're still understanding the gospel. Sometimes we live it better than other times, and we're just growing into it from belief to unbelief to belief in every area of life. A couple of examples about how this happened. So Peter is a well-known he's the well-known disciple. He was kind of the leader of that group, of the first group of disciples. And not all his words and not all his actions were right. We know that. We know Peter well. After probably more than 2 years of being with Jesus, Jesus said to all the disciples, I'm going to suffer and die. And Peter says to Jesus, you can't do that. And then Jesus rebuked him, and he even said, get behind me, Satan. What you're doing is satanic. I was meant to die. So Jesus was with him for 2 years, but he hadn't still got that, and he wasn't ready to believe that yet. We all know about Peter at the time of the crucifixion and his denial of Jesus, and that's a well-known story. So he wasn't a very faithful, believing disciple then. And then a few years later, and I always think this is a funny one, Jesus was so clear that as he went around teaching with his disciples, that he would go to the people that other people rejected. He would go to the lepers, and he would go to the publicans and, the sinners and so on. And he would even go to the foreigners, not just the Jews. And he would do things, and he would heal people who were not Jews. And so Peter and the disciples are watching all this. And then we read the book of Acts, and we come to Acts chapter 10, and there is this man who is not a Jew, but he's a God-fearing man, Cornelius. And it takes quite a while for God, through the Holy Spirit, to convince Peter that he needs to go and share the good news with this man. And here's Peter that's been with Jesus, and he's seen what Jesus has done. But it's taken a few years for him, for the penny to drop, that all people are welcome in God's kingdom. So, Peter is already a leader in the disciples, but he's still growing. He's growing from unbelief to belief. If I think about my own life and my own journey, and I've told you many times, I started going to church when I was 4 or 5 years old, maybe even younger. And then, and I suppose I learned to do things that were approved by church people, because that's where I kind of grew up. Then as a teenager, I started to see that some of the way I lived was actually what God approved of. And I did pray, and I did ask God to forgive my sins. But did I always act out of faith in God? Of course I didn't. I fought with my siblings. I argued with my dad when I got mad at him. I did things at school to get approval from some kids at the expense of others. But I also had conversion experiences along the way. I think some people would call them epiphanies. Bible verses started speaking to me. Prayers got answered. I opened myself to God. I came under great conviction in relation to serving God overseas, which I eventually followed through on. But I hadn't arrived yet. I was on the journey from unbelief to belief, being transformed by the gospel. And I think it's like, I know it's like that for all of us. We make steps of faith. Sometimes we make really big steps, but we still show the fruit of unbelief. We take up some kind of ministry at church or elsewhere, and we feel more satisfied. But we still have trouble forgiving some people. We judge others. We harbor secret sins. Like Jonah, we do right things with wrong motives. We lie on our tax return. We're not always honest in our dealings with people. We hate our enemies, not love them. We speak harshly to our spouse. We engage in addictive behavior. We don't call out wrong. We're still learning. We're still between unbelief and belief. Followers of Jesus admit that's the way it is and humbly look to God to change them. So being a disciple is not just about converting people, it's about letting God transform us and transform others. And we will play a part in that, and we need to play a part in that, helping others to become his followers too. Jesus calls people like us to follow him. People who follow, but who are very much learners. People who are moving from unbelief to belief. And he says, as you follow, bring others with you too. In your everyday life with the people you naturally come into contact with, point them to me. Look for opportunities to serve them. Pray for them. Look for common ground and build relationships with them. You know, during the week at Opshop, and I think, Barry, you might have been a witness to this, or you might have been part of this conversation, but Alan Barry was here at Opshop Thursday, and I think a lady came here for the first time, and she started to talk to a few of the people that were there, told them a bit about her life. It became, at some point, Alan Barry felt, free to ask her, would you like me to pray for you? He did pray for her. She was really touched by that, and then they ended up, I believe, reading parts of the Bible together. I share that only to say that here was something that just happened in the normal course of life. It just happened. It wasn't a planned campaign to do that. Alan was here with Carol, helping out at the op shop. This lady came in and that happened. An opportunity came about. That's how it is. You've heard, we've all heard the term, not yet Christians. It's a very positive term because it says everyone is a potential Jesus follower, a potential disciple of Jesus. Being and making disciples is one of the main things that we're asked to do. My last point. It's also really important for us to make disciples in the context of community. We don't just do it alone. In the first century, disciple making often happened in community. Jesus would teach people and heal people and feed people with the other disciples. They participated in what he was doing. When he was opposed or questioned and had discussions with people, they were present. Some of us gather here on a Sunday, and it's great to be together, but we don't have the opportunity to get to know each other deeply on a Sunday. We still need to be in community in a more comprehensive way in order that we get to know each other and we get a chance, in a sense, to practice what it's like to be disciples together. And then also to be involved in mission together. And so we are trying this year to encourage more life groups. That's why we're starting a life group this afternoon at 4 o'clock. There's another small group of guys that have been meeting from December. We meet at Barry's house. And we're trying to encourage people to start to connect. If you feel like you want to be part of a life group, to look for appropriate ways in which you connect with 3 or 4 people, and we'll help to direct and help that to happen. But we want to encourage people to do that as part of what it means to be a disciple in community. So we'll continue to talk about that and encourage people to be doing that. And certainly, as I said, try to help and direct those. But we would like, as many of us as possible, to also be part of these groups where we can get to know each other better and also do and learn the things that God wants us to do as we continue to make disciples in the world, in our community. So next week, we want to talk, as we go on with the series, how important it is to belong in community, and we're going to talk about our identity as disciples. Who are we? Who am I? You know, that's a question that we all ask. Who am I? And what's my purpose in this world? We'll talk more about that next week. But I want to come back to another story to finish off from this book. It's a great story. So, the background of this is that she is now, met lots of other Christians, and she's kind of grown in her faith a bit, and she's kind of grown to, I suppose, to hear God and respond to God in different ways in different circumstances. But the thing about money for her is still happening. You know, God has provided for her, and then at certain times, God reminds her that He needs to listen and be able to part with some things, and in her case, it's money. So here's this great story. The urban mission, so I think she learned, this happened in Los Angeles when she was doing some kind of training for acting. The urban mission had opened my eyes to the other side of LA, the side belonging to those who had been born there. So towards the end of my time there, I sat in an Echo Park laundromat, waiting for my washing and watching people. A mother with multiple children at her feet sweated as she soaked, washed, and dried load after load. She looked utterly exhausted. My heart ached for her, an ache I didn't recognize then. Her plight made me want to sob, her body moving so painfully through the motions of service, while her children pulled at her clothes. Give her money. I froze. Up until this point, I had vaguely known each person God had marked out to me. I had not approached a stranger. I argued with him, as I was prone to do whenever confronted. Is this really you, though? Or do I just feel compassion for her? The voice of God rushed in, hard and hot. Compassion is how I move. The entire point is compassion. I watched her for another 5 minutes before finding the courage to go to an ATM outside and get out a very fat wad of cash. I emptied out my laundry powder bag to put the money in, and the paper notes were flecked with spots of white. It could not have looked more like a drug deal if I had worn a sign on my head that said cocaine. I walked back in and couldn't see the woman anywhere. She and her children had left. I felt tears rise up in me from some odd, desperate place. Had I not obeyed quickly enough? Then, in a breath, she appeared in the doorway, frowning slightly, daydreaming about some other reality. I threw myself in her path, stuttering, and pressed the bag of cash into her hand. God told me to give this to you. A wild, knowing smile broke across her face. She looked regal, full of authority. She took the money, nodding. Thank you for your obedience. What? I just got off the phone with my pastor. He prayed for God to show me His love, so thank you for listening. God chuckled, and I felt my heart grow just a little. I think that discipleship, God calls us into discipleship because it is an exciting life. It might not always feel like what I've just read you out of a book from bits and pieces of a person's life. But God can work like that. And I know some of the stories, and I know it happens with various people for you. But I want us to be encouraged by that, to say God can work as we listen, as we follow, as we obey. And we'll hear more about that in the next few weeks. We're going to end with a great